Today we are talking about the American Revolution. The tension between Great Britain and their colonies was caused with the Proclamation Line of 1763, taxes and taxation without representation. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was a border between the newly acclaimed land from the British. And after the 7 Years' War, they created the Proclamation Line of 1763. This made it so that the colonists could not cross that line into the newly acquired land from the British. And of course, this did not make the colonists happy. Aside from the Proclamation of 1763, after the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War, Britain began to tax the colonists at very high rates to help pay for the war debts. The colonists felt as though Britain was abusing its power and believed that they should not have to pay for another country's debt when it was Britain's war. This caused the colonies to revolt against the taxes. This is around the time of the Boston Massacre and also the formation of the Committee of Correspondence. Samuel Adams organized the Committee of Correspondence, and this was created in many colonies in order to unify the colonies and keep British oppression alive. They communicated by usually just letters, and this also helped to create a more complex system of communication within the colonies, and that was known as the intercolonial correspondence. As the war came closer, tensions grew even more. The colonists began to boycott British goods and revolt to British taxes. Britain did pull back some of the taxes, but they did not pull back the tea tax, and this in turn led to the Boston Tea Party. And of course, if you don't know what the Boston Tea Party is, a bunch of colonists dressed up like Indians and went to the Boston port and dumped out a bunch of British tea, of course costing the British a lot of money in the supply of tea. After the Boston Tea Party, the British were just enraged by this act of rebellion, and they placed on the colonies the Intolerable Acts. Some major examples of some of those Intolerable Acts were things like the Boston Port Act, which closed off all trade in the Boston port. A second major intolerable act was the Quartering Act, and it gave British troops stationed in the colonies the power to be able to lodge in anyone's house at any time. The Intolerable Acts ultimately pushed the colonies to have the First Continental Congress, which had a total attendance of 13 colonies. The only colony not in attendance was Georgia, and they sent a letter of approval to the war. At this point, the beginning of the war was only about a year away. Now, before the war starts, the Continental Congress tries to write the British Parliament in an effort to keep the peace and control the British control over the American colonies. However, when the British Parliament receives their letter, they reject it and they just totally disrespect it. And at that point, the colonies prepare for war. In April of 1775, British troops marched to Concord to capture ring rebel leaders and ammunition hordes, and they are met by the Minutemen, and at this point, the shot heard around the world happens. However, very minimal casualties happen since there isn't much fighting, there aren't that many shots that go off, and at that point, the British move on to Lexington. But at this point, the colonists are ready, and it's a lot greater and better fight, and this was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The British, of course, had major advantages going into the war. They had better generals, better troops, and a larger population, but the colonies had home turf and the advantage of holding lines instead of invading. Other advantages were after the Battle of Saratoga, the French aided the colonists instead of the British, and the Americans would be led by George Washington. And George Washington would have a major turning point in the war as he leads his troops across the Delaware River to have a surprise attack on the British on Christmas Day of 1776. This would give a major advantage to the colonies and would significantly turn the tides of the war in their favor. On September 28, 1781, George Washington would lead 17,000 French and Continental troops into what would be the final battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown. This crippled the British forces, and General Cornwallis was finally forced to surrender. The Revolutionary War would officially come to an end when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Alright, that's it for today. I hope this helped you out in learning about the Revolutionary War, and thanks for listening.